So hello, welcome. I would say good evening, but it's lunchtime with you guys, I think. Let's just contextualize the conversation very briefly. For those who don't know me, I'm the author of the Truth of Yoga. Daniel Simpson is my name. I teach primarily, I suppose, what we started in this was working at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, where I teach online courses, and there used to be a lot more in person, but these things have unfortunately been a little bit torpedoed by the pandemic and the growth of online learning. But then this is what enables me to be in Arizona while sitting in Oxfordshire in the UK. So I do that. I also run my own online courses. I also teach on yoga teacher trainings here in the UK and elsewhere around the world. And what I really like to do, as Melissa may have mentioned, is to ask awkward questions. I used to be a journalist, and I like to interrogate the material that we're looking at. And I think there's a real need for that in the modern yoga world, because there aren't really texts from ancient Indian tradition that talk about life in the 21st century as a Westerner, unsurprisingly. And there aren't really even texts that talk about the practices that we do today until the 20th century. So we've got to do some interpreting, I think, of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how that relates to all this old material. And it's not that we should throw it all away. It's just that we need to ask a few questions. So in that spirit, I'd like to invite you to ask me anything, which is always a dangerous invitation to hand out. But I'll do my best. And if I don't know the answer, I'm always happy to admit it and see if we can figure out where we might find it.
Well,
So over to you guys. Yes.
Something really simple, Daniel. What is, I know your first name is Daniel.
Yes.
What is your last name?
Simpson, Simpson. Yes.
Thank you.
That one I can do.
All right, great. Thank you.
Welcome.
I actually have a question that might get us started out. I think it's really interesting. I've noticed that you've started coming up, like bringing men back into the practice, right? And what is it like for men to come back in, because it's so turned from where it was originally, right? It started out with just men, then I don't know, Krishnamacharya students, we get Indra Devi over here in Hollywood, and we get all of the others, and it's all women. And now, we're lucky to see a couple of guys in a class. And so what do you make of, that kind of switch in balance and the going back and forth of who practices yoga, and how do we, maybe as modern teachers, become more inclusive and get more, just different people in our classroom?
Well, that's the challenge, I suppose. Because of the shift, and just to emphasize, can't really sort of make it clear enough in some ways that for most of the history of yoga, the texts were written by men for men, and they describe men, and I'm sure you've been hearing about this already, but we just don't really know how many women practiced. There are contexts in which they might have done. There are some sources that give us some clues that there were some practices that women were permitted to engage in. Particularly chanting of non-Vedic mantras and a little bit of pranayama, and that might have gone on in the home. And I think in the same way, fast forward a few thousand years to today, men are engaged in aspects of yoga, whether they realize it or not, but they tend to associate this word yoga with women in tight leggings and, the invitation to do things that they don't feel so capable of doing. And the more that yoga is associated with contortions, in some ways, the more appealing it is to the real type A achiever men. But I think the less accessible it is to the average male body. It's not that accessible to anybody's body, frankly, advanced contortions. But this association of yoga with flexibility is something that tends to sort of, I think, make men think that they will be out of their depth or uncomfortable. And if you are the only guy in the room and you're struggling with what people who are 20 years older than you are happily doing and smiling about, then it's embarrassing. And, I think a lot of men resist that. And I speak from my own experience, but I found something immediately accessible because the teacher was presenting the whole thing in a broader context. And and saying it wasn't about the doing of the thing. It was about the way we engaged with the reality in front of us right there, right now. And that's got nothing to do with shape making necessarily. So I think the more that yoga is presented as almost a toolkit for dealing with life, the more likely it is to speak to, particularly guys who like to think of themselves as problem solvers, but also anybody who's a little bit daunted by this prospect of wrapping themselves up like a pretzel. And that's the reputation yoga's got, for better or worse. And the way out of that, I think, is to start bringing it back to a way of it could be more comfortably embodied is what we could become, but also less afflicted between the ears, which most of us are, whatever our gender or stage of life. Stuff goes on that we don't know how to deal with, and yoga is really about that, relating to the sources of suffering that we create for ourselves and trying to remove them. And so mindfulness, I think, has done a better job than yoga of making that sound sort of, I guess, instrumental, something that you can take and use for your own purposes. And I think guys are much more likely to be found in a mindfulness group than they are in a yoga class for that reason. So.
Yeah. Unless it's beer yoga, pub yoga.
Well, there's that, of course, yeah. Although then we would have to start questioning whether the word yoga belongs in that particular compound.
Yeah.
I would have comments about that myself. But I would love to have you address, because one of the reasons I focus so heavily in my 300-hour teacher training on philosophy and history is because for me, it is one of the ways in which I address the whole appropriation versus appreciation, type of I don't want to say conflict, but just, how do we find ourselves as these modern day yogis, recognizing where we've come from, where we've been, where we're going, and do it in a way that's respectful, but also allows for the evolution and change. So I would love to have your take on that.
Wow, it's straight in at the deep end, isn't it? We've had gender, and now we're effectively on to race. So I think it's important to understand how yoga has evolved from what was once an ascetic practice of renouncing the world that was particular to the worldviews of ancient India into what it is now, which is basically a globalized industry. And in the process, it's clearly been unmoored from its traditional kind of anchor point. It's got some connection to the earliest ideas that inspired yoga practice, but that can become pretty tenuous. And the more we understand that yoga has changed, the easier it is to start to look at this sensibly, I think. Part of the problem that crops up for me listening to some of the conversations around appropriation is that you end up with people effectively unable to hear each other's point of view, because there's one perspective that says yoga is inherently Indian, it's inherently timeless, it can never go anywhere except with the sort of blessing of that tradition. And there's another point of view which is sort of kind of perennialist and suggests that the essence of yoga is to be found in our own experience, and nobody owns it. It's got nothing to do with any particular dogmatic system of knowledge. And those two perspectives just can't really hear each other. And the truth is that yoga's never really had a single essence. It's always been in flux. It's a hybrid that has been reinvented countless times throughout its history, but always with some attempt to preserve a connection to previous iterations. And some of the most inventive teachers, Melissa mentioned Krishnamacharya, have gone to great lengths to disguise their own creativity by pretending that all they were doing was, restating the timeless truths of the Vedas. And that wasn't, just to be awkward. It was because that's how you innovate in traditional Indian contexts. You just present, a modified interpretation of the same idea. And you therefore have to find ways of dressing it up in the old language. You have to find points of connection, even if you've turned everything completely upside down. So there's always a process of looking back while looking forwards. And what tends to happen in the West, especially if there's that worldview of, never mind this connection to ancient Indian ideas, or particularly to Hinduism, there's, the sense almost that we've got free reign to do whatever we want and call it yoga. And to a certain extent, we have, I think, within our own engagement with experience, because first of all, there really shouldn't be a yoga police hanging around, handing out tickets. But I think we also need to be careful not to overgeneralize from that experience. What everybody does in their own personal practice is really their business. But how they talk about it, how they market it, how they frame it, in a broader cultural context, how they commoditize it, monetize it, franchise it, whatever it might be, that's different. And that understandably annoys people. And part of the reason that it's so annoying is that, as Anglophone Westerners, we push buttons in the Indian subcontinent, having, sort of in our earlier history, particularly my country, the United Kingdom, colonized India and exploited it ruthlessly, and showed utter disdain in some ways for its traditions while stealing everything we could get. And so the idea that Westerners still take that approach to something sacred is going to push buttons. But we can't help history. We can't. I was just watching recently, actually, there's a documentary that's on the BBC. If you've got any way of getting access to it, it was a very interesting program about Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. It's so controversial, the Indian government has banned it under emergency powers. But I think you can find it online. And the former British Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, who's a man in some ways I don't have a lot of time for, given his promotion of the invasion of Iraq, among other things. He was also at that time quite critical of the Indian government, particularly of Modi, who was at that time chief minister in 2002 of the state of Gujarat, where he effectively allowed the massacre of a large number of Muslims as a revenge strike for the killing of some Hindu pilgrims. And looking at all of that, Jack Straw is saying, well, okay, the Indian government's not going to listen to me, and they'll say I'm just the inheritor of colonial legacy. But right is right and wrong is wrong, regardless of where you've been born and whatever people did in a previous generation. So just because Westerners colonized India, just because there's been an enormous amount of disrespect and imbalance of power in relations between East and West, we can't just sort of get stuck on that forever. I think we have to find some way of living with it. And this word you used, appreciation, is I think important. Firstly, to understand, in some ways we're guests in somebody else's house, and it never hurts to act accordingly, and to think, okay, I still got my own life, my own way of relating to this. It's much easier to do this if you actually do travel and go and situate yourself in another culture. It's much harder to misbehave in that way. It's much easier to think one can, running away back to one's own country and doing what one pleases. And so I think, to sort of tie all that together, lots of disparate ideas there, we, as modern yoga practitioners, are inevitably reinventing yoga. We just can't help it. We are living in a different context to that which produced the teachings. We're even living in a different culture to the one that informs the whole, philosophy of yoga. So we will, end up producing a new thing, whether we like it or not. And I think the most honest thing we can do is admit that. And the more open we are about our agency in it all, the easier it is to own it and stand up and be counted and say, this is my interpretation, rather than this is my sort of articulation of the timeless truths of yoga, or even worse, everything that we want to have said, we put in the mouth of somebody like Patanjali and claim that we've got, 2,000-year-old sanction for whatever it is we've just dreamed up. And so those things, might to some feel like appreciation, but in the end, I think they're just dishonest. And if we come back to, you know, there's a word that modern Hindus like to use to describe their religion. It's a phrase that crops up in very old texts, in the Mahabharata in particular. So dharma is a word that's often used for religion. It's a way of, you know, defining the right thing to do, how to act in the world. And the adjective sanatana is sometimes joined with it. Sanatana dharma, the eternal dharma, the sort of timeless truth of how one should behave. And there are two principles that crop up in Patanjali's list of ethical do's and don'ts, non-harming and truth. And those are, you know, really the essence of the Sanatana Dharma. They are applicable to everybody in every life stage, every situation. How to find a balance between non-harming and truth. And so, as I say, I think if we're honest, but at the same time motivated by that essential commitment to non-harming, that's the foundation of really, you know, all Dharmic philosophy. Acknowledging at the same time that we'll inevitably do a bit of harm, whether we plan to or not, but we try to minimize it. Then I think, you know, there's a prospect of actually you know, showing some respect for a tradition that we are inevitably going to change, and also then thinking consciously about how can we preserve some of that tradition in what we pass forwards. Because if we're not trying to do that, it'll die out. We'll just be left with muck yoga. And you know, we can't be sort of, you know, channeling the Vedas like ancient rishis. So there isn't a timeless, you know, transmission of that sort. Things have changed again and again and again. We're changing things again and again and again. I don't think we have the permission that people like Krishnamacharya, as a Brahmin in a, you know, a very esteemed lineage, could grant himself to just sort of pretend it was all revealed to him in a dream by an ancient sage. I think we have to just stand up and be counted and say, this is my take on what yoga means to me. And if we're doing that, it's much harder to annoy anybody. People can say, well, you're wrong. And you can say, yes, okay, thank you. You can have your opinion too. But if we're trying to say this is yoga for everybody, it gets a lot more complicating. So those are my opinions, but I'm very happy to be disagreed with if anybody sees things differently. And you know, I know these topics are very emotionally charged, and I don't think there's a right answer to the sort of question of where the red lines are. I think we have to ask our own questions of ourselves about that sort of thing. Is this the right thing to do?
One of the things that keeps coming up. My name's Valerie. Hi, Daniel. Nice to meet you. And thank you for sharing your time with us. This is so interesting already. I'm going to listen to it over and over again because there's so many beautiful gems of information there. But what you said most recently kind of ties back into, we've been discussing a lot history and the present, and history and the present, and kind of these cycles and circles, and ultimately what is our why? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we offering this particular thing on this particular day to this particular group of people? Mm-hmm. And somehow that was tied back to what you said about just our truth. And I guess it's not really a question, but I wonder what some of the sages, like if they were consciously thinking of this why, you know, or kind of the stimulation behind making these changes, commercialization versus some sort of personal expansion or ego, or if maybe you could just, I don't know, have any insights about that kind of thing. And then way back, you were talking about men maybe being a little more interested in mindfulness as opposed to yoga. And that made me think about, you know, kind of this circle. And do you feel with your understanding and knowledge of what's going on today, that we're making this kind of full circle, that yoga is coming away in certain parts of the world anyway, coming away from this emphasis on the physical and coming back to the emphasis on the mental?
I'll start with that last question. I think it's an excellent question. I don't think there's any way to give a definitive answer, but my sense is that, you know, the yoga bubble is bursting, finally, in the sense that the sort of spiritualization of aerobics classes that was essentially, you know, the last 15, 20 years of the yoga boom. Not in every context, of course, but there was a lot of that going on. Is going to pass and hand over to other things. There's people who will be interested in, you know, a hot, sweaty yoga class for some time yet, perhaps forever. It's a nice thing to do in some ways, but there's all sorts of reappraisals of, you know, how to approach that kind of a practice anyway, because you do it for a long time and it gets more complicated. Yeah, there's an increasing interest through, I think, the mainstreaming of mindfulness in the last 15 years in, you know, dealing with the fundamental problems of you know, being a human being in this difficult time. And yoga and mindfulness have come from the same place. The Buddha and early yogis were engaged in exactly the same project. They just invented slightly different frameworks for dealing with it. But they've basically got the same ingredients. And so coming back to this broader why, which is a really important question, I think, it's the kind of the key to keeping this sort of, you know, I guess, relay race going on over the generations of handing on the baton. If the why, however much we might, you know, reframe it to suit our time, is still dealing with this fundamental question of how we cause ourselves suffering in the terms that these ancient sages were you know, conceiving of it, then I think we have that continuity. That's not to say that you can then offer anything and dress it up in that language necessarily, but a sincere engagement with that question immediately brings us back to ourselves, because the bottom line is we are our own problem. We cause ourselves problems by the way we relate to our experience, by the things that we get, you know, stuck on, attached to, the things that we desire. Basically, that's the fundamental, you know, root of it all. And the more attached we are to self-satisfaction, the harder it is to be happy, perversely. And the easier we find it to let go of some of that conditioning, perversely, the easier it is to be content with, you know, whatever comes our way, even if it's not very pleasant at all. And yeah, those ideas are there in the background of that is the basis of what's taught in a modern mindfulness class. All of that can be taught as part of a yoga posture class as well. You can frame the whole thing in those terms, and yeah, it's not necessarily the case that you abandon the postural teaching, but yeah, I think it's the framing. So the why and then also the how are, to my mind, a lot more important than the what. Yeah, you can teach any number of things in alignment with a worldview that's oriented towards the removal of suffering, and that has a particular idea of what needs to be present in the application of the methods to ensure that happens. I think the first thing is, you know, coming back to truth and non-harming, being honest with ourselves about whether we're actually helping. And you know, who are we helping? We're just helping ourselves, or are we helping ourselves to be less unhelpful to everybody else? And already that sort of question about how is shaping, you know, decisions, not just about, you know, what we might do in a practice or in a class that we teach, but how we relate to ourselves and each other's 24/7, or at least the hours that we're awake. Although some might say dream yoga has its place also, and yeah, while we're asleep, we're revealing all of that conditioning that causes us all the problems, you know, in the rest of the waking day. So there is this ongoing project of looking at how we relate to things, and that is consistent with some of the priorities of older sages, but their how, I think, was really unappealing to most of us, if we're honest about it, because they took this problem so seriously, and it was so bound up with the idea of reincarnation that it was, for the sake of removing future lives, desirable to almost forego this life. No more life, no more problem, no more action, no more craving, you know, no more attachment to anything. And to a certain extent, there's a lot of truth in that. Drift through life not needing anything, and it'll all be fine. But we don't live in a world that's supportive of that. You know, the only way that you can actually do that is to be a homeless person, and it's not a very pleasant existence, even if you don't, you know, starve to death. In the Indian context, this was culturally supported in a different way. So what sounds to us really off-putting is, you know, perhaps a little bit more sustainable in that ancient setting. Even today, there are people who still try to live that way, but it's pretty marginal. We live in a different context where there are problems of, you know, capitalism and you know, the struggle just to stay afloat, and it's inevitable that therefore people have, once they've developed some kind of proficiency with these practices, wanted to sell it, wanted to you know, showcase their talents for marketing purposes, wanted to generate interest in this transformative method, with, you know, the vested interest in profiting, and it's understandable, but at the same time it might not be consistent with ancient tradition. However, it wasn't, you know, the Westerners who first dreamed up yoga marketing, and early 20th century India is full of examples, including Krishnamacharya, who made propaganda films, as he called them, and had business cards and had posters that said all sorts of, you know, indefensible things about where his practices came from, and, you know, how they would transform you. I say indefensible in the sense that they're not really, you know, rooted in fact. They were more wishful thinking, a nice way of, you know, dressing your shop window. And so I think again, it doesn't mean that we should cut ourselves slack and say, oh, we can do what we want, because yoga commoditization started, you know, long before the Westerners got their grubby paws on it. But I do think it shows us that these are human responses to human situations, and part of, I think, the reality of being an honest yogi in the 21st century, I'm not even sure the word yogi is the right one, an honest practitioner, is to admit to being human, to being flawed, perhaps even to remove the concept of becoming perfected, which is one of the ways of defining the goals of yoga. Siddhi, the state of, you know, having these powers, literally means accomplishment, attainment, perfection. To be enlightened, the same thing, the idea that you can never do anything wrong. I don't think I've ever met anybody who could never do anything wrong. We all have the potential to you know, mess up. The question is, are we watching? Are we concerned to try and make amends? Are we trying to just, you know, I use this word mindfully again. I'm not trying to sell mindfulness necessarily, but, you know, I think modern Buddhism has done a pretty good job with mindfulness, of taking, you know, some of the basic materials of the Buddha's teachings, secularizing them, you know, franchising them, making it really easy for anybody to get their heads around them. And that's actually quite helpful. It might be muck mindfulness in many cases, and it might be commoditized and, you know, taught for profit and introduced in corporations to keep people passive and not demanding more pay, and, you know, any number of things you can say about it. But there is the possibility that they might, you know, be a little bit more inspired to go a bit deeper. So it's not a bad thing. Yoga could do with a similar thing, actually, of taking some of the deeper wisdom of mental transformation and making that as accessible as, you know, the flow sequence that anybody can learn in, you know, a weekend and then teach for the next couple of years in gyms. So I think there is, not to say that commoditization is great, but there's helpful simplification that can be the first step on the ladder that might lead to a deeper contemplation of truths. And in a way, that's what, you know, bringing philosophy into yoga class is all about. It's just, you know, having a few little things to get a handle on. Perhaps if it's, you know, even just one principle restated in 50 different ways for a year, a few students are going to get it, and they're going to be curious, and they're going to want to know what to do with it. And then maybe it's time for the next one. Don't have to communicate the entirety of the vast ocean of yogic knowledge in, you know, every class that we teach. It'd be impossible, and people would leave because they'd say, I came here for yoga, not for a lecture. So that's a long-winded answer.
Asana, right?
All over the place. Sorry, Melissa, you say?
I said, I came here for asana.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. People have conflated the word yoga with asana.
Yeah.
asana is part of an approach to yoga, has been for a long time. It originally meant sitting. It's been, you know, associated with doing other things with the body for 1,000 years or so, and in the last 100 years has, you know, become the focus of the practice. It's the way in. It's accessible, but it isn't in itself yoga. In fact, even yoga as the idea of a practice or something to do is not what most ancient sources talk about. Yoga is a state of being, and therefore there are many ways that you can access it. And asana might be, depending on how you approach it, so there's the how question coming in, a way of attaining a state that is, you know, a little bit more clear, concentrated, skillful, capable of discerning the difference between that which is helpful and that which is not. Yeah, this is the outcome of the practice in a way. It's why we practice. So coming back to the why in a different way to get a little bit closer to yoga. Whereas what we might be doing is floundering around like flawed human beings caught up in samsara, doing our best. But you know, we get a bit nearer to yoga through doing that. The idea that we're doing yoga almost sort of takes away the real truth of there being somewhere deeper to get. And it's so easy to get stuck on, you know, how good are my shapes? Let's take pictures of them and stick them on the internet.
Yeah, I think one of the other things, just to kind of step a little bit further, we've talked a lot about, you know, using some of the texts, because of course, what do we do in teacher trainings? We're doing, you know, Patanjali, we're doing the Bhagavad Gita, we're doing, you know, Upanishads, Mahabharata, we're pulling all these things. And, you know, from the framework perspective, can we use, how would you incorporate, or is it okay to incorporate the framework to pass that baton, right? Or do we just, what is post-philosophy look like?
Very good question. Well, what does post-philosophy look like? Well, I think first of all, I mean, I've said it once and I'll say it again, you know, I think we really have to acknowledge that none of this is actually going to provide us with what we're looking for, which is a step-by-step list of instructions for how to live today, or even, you know, more simply, what the yoga practice component of how to live today might look like. Because things have moved on since 2,000 years ago, unsurprisingly. You know, our understanding of the mind and the body has been refined, you know, vastly. And you know, even to take the weird and wonderful world of the subtle body teachings in Tantra-inspired physical yoga texts as the sort of the gospel truth of how the body works would, yeah, clearly well, it'd be a way of living, I suppose, but it would be like going back to the Middle Ages in Europe, where people put leeches on the body to try and suck out diseases. That was the way people looked at things at that time. There is a way in which those teachings can be really, you know, powerful and part of a transformative you know, shift in our perspective on what it means to be embodied. They can be harnessed in the same way that they always were, a sort of way of visualizing an energetic component to our lived experience. So they're just a different way of knowing. And I think if we always look at these texts as containing different ways of knowing, it's, you know, a little bit easier to avoid the confusion that arises, or the desperate desire to sort of pretend that Patanjali is talking about modern yoga practice. Instead, we just look at them as other and say, well, from the wreckage of this other, what can be salvaged almost? And some might say, you know, especially using terms like wreckage, that's disrespectful, and that this is the essence of cultural appropriation, cherry picking what we want from old texts. I would disagree, because I think the process that we're engaged in is trying to be honest. When I say the wreckage, it's more, you know, what's left after we've admitted this, this, and this, and this just doesn't apply to the way I want to go about this today. I can't try to be an ascetic from the Iron Age, because I don't live in the Iron Age and I'm not an ascetic. So I have to do something else. And therefore, all sorts of verses and concepts and yeah, whole philosophical systems might therefore not work for us in quite the way that they're meant to. But we can still, I think, try to, you know, retain some of the spirit of what motivated those quests. I think we can also use a lot of the methodological framework that they present. So to give a really clear example, a really simple example, in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali is basically, although everybody talks about 8 limbs and the gradual process of, you do your asana practice and you're already 3rd rung on the ladder to attaining samadhi. The truth is he's talking about a way of seeing beyond the mind and the body. That's really all Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are about. And having seen beyond the mind and the body, the yogi doesn't really care about his mind or body ever again. Is quite content to almost sit in the corner and let go of the mind and the body forever. And we're not going to do that. But the only way to get to that point, which is, way down the track, even if we were seriously, sincerely seeking it, is through the mind and the body. And the whole of the Samkhya philosophy that the Yoga Sutra is based on is getting more familiar with how the mind and the body work in order to be able to leave them behind, let go of them. So we can just say, okay, well, we're reframing it to say, I don't want to let go of my mind and my body. I just want to be more skillfully inhabiting them. And we can still use that whole framework, because the discerning process that Patanjali is advocating to be able to let go of everything is to tell the difference between things, to be honest about what's this and what's that. In his case, what's the spirit behind the mind and the body, what's just the mind getting in the way. Let it go, get subtler and subtler. We can just be back at the level of what's causing more pain, how can we unwind it? And we can broaden that out to societal level. What am I doing that is unconstructive, not conducive to benefit for those around me, even if it's just my immediate circle? And that will start to sound more like the Buddha's teachings, but actually most of the Yoga Sutra is very similar to what the Buddha had to say, so much so that the 4th chapter was written to be rude about Buddhism, just so that it could be clearly stated this isn't a Buddhist text. Otherwise, there's a lot of overlap. And in the end, I think we'll probably end up mixing and matching. And most philosophical presentations today, whether they call themselves philosophy or not, are doing this. So to me, the honest question is really, are we thinking about the well-being of the whole rather than just my own selfish self-satisfaction? If we're doing that, that's aligned with the broader principle of Dharma, and almost any teachings that come under that umbrella are relevant. But then if we've broadened it out that far, why not also include Stoicism, which has got the same sort of philosophy as what the Buddha had to say, what's also in the Bhagavad Gita, knowing the difference between what we can control in the world and what just causes us misery because we get attached to trying to control it and fail. So we can control how we respond to our inner experience, the Stoics say. Well, again, that's starting to sound like mindfulness. It's basically the Buddha's idea. It's basically what the Upanishads and Patanjali were getting at. So I'm not trying to say we sort of reduce it all down to this thin gruel where everything's the same, but to at least understand there's a sort of commonality of framework in there. And post-philosophy means we need our own framework. So back to why, why are we doing any of this? We have to find our own answer to that. But once we've got the framework, then we can go into these sources and find useful material. And as I say, so long as we're presenting this is my Daniel Simpson in 2023, my take on philosophy, or my take on, never mind the word philosophy, could even just sort of say how to live, or how to do the right thing. That's the essence of Dharma, how to live in accordance with trying to do the right thing. I see no harm in that, really. It's just, trying to make sense of life, inspired. If we could be yoga inspired rather than pretending to be yogis, I think that would already be a good step forward. Yoga adjacent, perhaps, or whatever weird phrase you might want to apply to it, because at least that makes it crystal clear that we're already one stage removed from this stuff, which I think gives us a certain permission to relate to it differently. But as I say, we'll have to be open to the fact that somebody might come along and tell us they disagree with us. And that's okay. We're allowed to disagree with each other. I think that's the challenge in the modern world, is actually to coexist happily disagreeing. It seems to be a thing that's gone so far out of fashion that everybody wants the other to immediately agree, or they are, one of them, not one of us, who needs to be violently disagreed with and outed and othered and pushed away. And that's got nothing to do with the spirit of yogic understanding of what it means to relate to others. The skillful perspective is to be able to see from all sides. We've still got our own perspective, unless we've completely transcended self-centeredness. We've got our own, concerns. I worry about whether I can earn enough to pay my bills, or look after those who I care about. I don't really want to let go of that degree of attachment to this body and in these conditions, but I don't want to be so attached to it that I'm preoccupied with pleasing myself. So again, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I think that the post philosophy comes back to, who am I? Why am I doing this? What's it all for? And once we've got some answers to that, we can actually allow those to be completely provisional and rip them up tomorrow and come up with new ones. They don't have to be fixed. We don't have to get stuck on, I don't know the answer. All we need is a good enough answer for right now that feels to us true, that feels to us in alignment with what we've understood so far from our exposure to these teachings. And then we'll do the best we can. What more can we do?
Thank you.
Sorry. Those of you who haven't met me before, you can hear I like to talk, and I sometimes wind up in a completely different place to the one I was aiming for. But
well, I look at the yoga that I teach as really as a way to give tools to people to live out into the world the way that the world is now. And I wonder if the history of yoga, if it was more egocentric than that, or were they also trying to give people tools in order to survive in the world that they were in?
It's an excellent question. I think, if I'm really honest, from my studies, there are very few texts that are explicitly about yoga that show any concern really for anything other than the practitioner attaining the objective. And there are occasional lines. There's a very funny line in the commentary on the Yoga Sutra, the original commentary, sometimes attributed to Vyasa, which is talking about the fruits of practicing your yamas and niyamas, and saying that a yogi who's decided to really set foot on this path is motivated by concern for all beings. And if he suddenly finds himself, and it is largely a he, behaving in a way that's contrary to those principles, he needs to do something about it. And the sutra is number 33 in the second chapter. If you're doing the wrong thing, you need to cultivate the opposite tendency. So if you spot yourself, basically, wanting to harm people, there's a whole list of examples. If you find yourself thinking, I shall kill a wrongdoer, I shall lie, I shall steal somebody's money, I shall have sex with their wife, I shall become master of their property, in other words, the opposite of the yamas, then you need to think, well, okay, I should cultivate the opposite tendency. And the suggestion is, this is your sort of mantra that you should recite to yourself. While being baked in the terrible burning coals of cyclic existence, in other words, while being stuck in this worldly life, I have taken refuge in yoga dharma, the way of yoga, the path of yoga, the discipline of yoga, by offering protection to all living beings. So that's the sort of orientation to get more established in non-harming. But the whole orientation of a practitioner in the Yoga Sutra is to not harm other beings by removing oneself from society to sit in a cave. So yes, you're not causing harm, but what about all the other harm that everybody else is still causing? That isn't the practitioner's concern. In fact, there's another sutra, the 33rd sutra in the first chapter, which is all about using contemplations on beneficial qualities to calm the mind. And talk about compassion, friendliness, the sort of appreciative joy, taking pleasure in other people's pleasure. And the last one is equanimity, even-mindedness. And the even-mindedness is linked in the commentary with people who do harm, evildoers. It says, if you can be totally equanimous in the face of evildoers, then your mental peace won't be disturbed. You can devote yourself to purifying your mind. Nothing will get you out of your meditation, wagging your finger and shouting. and that's the orientation of the yogi primarily. There is always this flavor of compassion, the idea that you might get enlightened and teach everybody else, or that you will just be this boundless source of good things, but sitting in the corner like a glowing vegetable. It's not yoga for life in the world. The one text that puts it in exactly the opposite way, crystal clear, is the Bhagavad Gita, talking about action in the world, saying anybody who sits in the corner is deluded. They're just, telling themselves that they're just egomaniacs, basically, thinking they're getting somewhere while actually, being of no good to themselves or to anybody else. Your duty is to act, says the Gita in the 3rd chapter, for that which is conducive to everyone's benefit. The well-being of all, what's called the holding together of the world, is the way it's explained, loka samgraha. That all sounds very pleasing, and so we might think, oh, let's go to the Bhagavad Gita, but all the verses that explain what that consists of are tied up with the caste system. And so it's in some ways an attempt to use yoga to defend hierarchy and to rehabilitate Vedic sacrifice as a religious tradition, and say, never mind all of this renouncing. Everybody should do their duty. The Brahmins should tend the fires. The king should pay them money to carry on performing the ritual. Everybody else should do the hard work so that we're all, able to feast, and everybody will be happy and there will be auspiciousness. That's not a very comfortable message either in some ways. People don't like to talk about the Gita that way. There's often an attempt to play it down and pretend that really the idea is you should find your own purpose and follow it. But that to me is a great example of the reinterpretation that we need to do. We all want to find, what we're good at and express it and offer what we can to the world. To align that in some way with yoga teachings, that's wonderful. But I think it's important to say that's what we think rather than what the Bhagavad Gita says, because the Bhagavad Gita has its own agenda. But again, this is sort of, to some extent, splitting hairs. If the upshot of all of it is to live life in a way that is in service of others, it doesn't really matter whether you're calling it the Bhagavad Gita or not. So again, we come back to the fundamental why. If we're putting ourselves at the center of the universe and expecting everybody to revolve around us, that's got really very little to do with these traditions. If we're living in a way that's not like that, then it is in accordance with this principle of dharma, the right thing to do, pure virtue, that which is supportive of the harmony of the whole. That's what that word means, even though it's also used to defend the unjust hierarchical structure of Indian society sometimes. But that's the word where we'll find all sorts of ideas about how to be nice to each other, how to serve other people, how to look after the bigger picture. And texts that are talking in those terms are worldly. They're not really talking about yoga. So although there was in that phrase I read out the compound yoga dharma, bringing the two things together, dharma is sort of in the background for anybody who grows up in an Indian context. But the texts that we look at that teach yoga, that's their only dharma. The dharma is liberation, moksha dharma, the pursuit of emancipation from this world. And that's the real, I think, tension that's between our way of seeing things for the most part and a lot of the old yoga texts. We want to be freer in the world, perhaps even to free others from their suffering. And that idea is there in the Buddhist tradition under the principle of the bodhisattva. Yoga traditions have largely constructed this worldview of let's get liberated from the world, and those who live in the world are concerned with helping other people. The yoga practitioners are just trying to somehow become pure light. Maybe they also have an ashram. Maybe in more recent centuries there's the idea of social service built around that, and there are traditions of that in Hindu contexts that go back quite some time. But you don't find yoga texts talking about that. Yoga texts are all about how to get myself out of the matrix rather than let's dismantle this matrix thing.
Thank you.
Welcome.
In your podcast, or in the podcast you were on, you said a line that just got stuck in my head. I've taken so many wrong turns that I ended up in the right direction or along that line. How would you say you handled coming from a journalist Western background into Eastern philosophy? Because I feel like that is, and I'm sorry, my cat is now being very distracting.
No worries.
I don't know if you can hear the paper bags going.
That's okay, yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of people, students might have that struggle with, we come with these Western backgrounds now. This is our lives. Like, I can't separate certain things, but I can unite. And like, what is the struggle in that?
It's a really good question. I think that's again part of this whole principle of honesty and starting where we are and acknowledging our worldview and our assumptions, and not trying to just pretend we're going to become love and light and that's going to solve everything and we'll grow a unicorn horn and everything will be rainbows and pretty kisses for here on ever after. Instead, we're here in this. In fact, having that worldview is a Western worldview in itself. It'd be interesting to own it and think, where did it come from? Where have we picked up some of these ideas that are, I guess, broadly categorized as New Age, which are relatively recent. Synthesis since the 60s of Eastern teachings, Western esotericism, magical thinking, wishful thinking, all sorts of things coming together. And so that's often what gets presented in connection with yoga, particularly online or particularly in a class where someone will just read out a motivational quote or perhaps a short poem. It might not have anything to do with the philosophy of yoga, but that's okay. I think if we actually start from saying that's the stuff that inspires me, that's my perspective, perhaps then we can be open to seeing difference between that worldview and the one we're looking at, rather than trying to constantly just pretend it all fits together seamlessly. And that, I suppose, is my experience. And when I said I'd taken so many wrong turns, just to clarify, I don't want to get lost in autobiography, but I did some pretty dumb things in my life, and have kind of burned a few too many bridges career-wise. I wound up practicing yoga because it was about the only thing that felt true to me anymore. I got quite radicalized as a foreign correspondent. I ranted a bit about Iraq earlier at the time that my employers were facilitating that war, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. Everybody wanted to just cough uncomfortably and look the other way and hope it would all blow over soon. I just, I didn't know what to do with all of that. So, I guess I got quite self-righteous. Combining that with an analytical mind, and also a heavy cannabis smoking problem got me very lost and very confused about what yoga was, especially as you go and hang out in India and these half-naked dreadlock sadhus are all sitting around fires chain smoking very strong hashish. So I think at first I didn't really understand what yoga was. That's the first thing. Secondly, when I did start to get a handle on it, I wanted to do my slightly anally retentive organizing, journalistic categorization of everything into nice package parcels. I wanted to explain it all and make it all bullet point simple. And the more I studied, the less possible it was to do that, because there's so many different worldviews that don't fit together. But I think it helped me in the end, because I kept pushing, or I kept pulling on the string almost until it all unraveled. And once it was all in pieces around me, I felt a bit better. I mean, it was not a happy experience. And I compounded that by then going to university and having a Western academic sort of approach to the study of yoga, take that to the next level, basically, grinding to dust any idea that there's any such thing as yoga. There's just all these competing discourses which can't all be right. Therefore, there isn't actually anything left at the end. But out of that, I felt a bit more empowered to start again from first principles and to think about, what does this stuff really mean? First of all, to me, but also in and of its own terms in each of these contexts, because everything makes sense in a particular context. Sometimes even just in a verse in a text, the text itself doesn't always make sense because it's copied and pasted from lots of other texts to come up with its own synthesis. But we can get back to this level where there's something that's just self-contained and clear, and out of that you can build something. Perhaps take two or three of those things, put them together, and that's a really clear sense of feeling anchored in something that feels true to me. And the bottom line really is all of these ideas are only relevant if they've got some sort of analog in embodied experience. if it's just an idea, you know, why are we goofing off about yoga philosophy? Why not something else? You know, I don't know. I could pick any number of things from the bookshelf. The reason this is interesting is because it relates to something that we can actually, be part of right here, right now. And so if it wasn't for spending time with teachers who really knew how to, first of all, talk about this, but also were very clearly talking from their own experience of what it meant to embody a deeper state of, I guess, clarity, really. And it was obvious from the way that they were, you know, day in, day out on a retreat, that helped me to understand that there are a few core principles that I see repeated in these texts, which are very, very clear. Once you've seen them, you can't really unsee them because they're constantly popping up. And they don't have a lot to do with a lot of the things that people like to talk about. They've got everything to do with something very grounded, something transcendent at the same time. So it's always paradoxical, something that's, you know, very, very, very straightforward and elementary, and yet, you know, so unattainable that we might strive for it forever, and can slip in and out of it at a moment's notice. And there isn't actually ultimately a way of talking about it, because it's something that's beyond language. It's just a way of perceiving, and really coming back to the idea that yoga is a state of being. That's what it is, and it's just suddenly seemed a lot clearer to me that that's what yoga was, and everything else was just, you know, fun. It's nice to throw a few shapes. It's good to do some breath control and still the mind a bit. It's more capable then of just facing reality. But facing reality is what we generally run a mile from, and I know in my own experience, I happily can talk myself through 2 hours of grueling asana practice before the sun comes up, just to avoid sitting still with my own painful experiences of being me, pretending that, oh yes, I'm getting somewhere with my yoga. But the reality is, can we just sit there with all of our stuff and not do anything? Yoga is really undoing rather than doing. And I think my striving, my desire to get somewhere, my kind of self-centered sense that I could make sense of it all, led me in unhelpful directions, practically speaking. And it was through writing a book that I really had to, I suppose, on the one hand, I mean, it's an enormous act of arrogance to write a book in the first place, never mind one with The Truth of Yoga on the cover. But I could only actually allow myself to do that because, I mean, I am quite hard on myself, I think, and quite self-critical. When I felt like I had humbled myself enough to admit that, first of all, I don't know everything, and secondly, I'm only going to talk about the things that I do think that I understand, and I'm going to talk about them in a way that not only seems to make sense to me, but makes sense to the teachers I've learned them from. And I can talk about that, and that's okay. So anybody who looks carefully at the book might notice I don't talk a great deal about tantric traditions that I don't have a lot of exposure to. I don't have a deeper understanding of in the same way that I do of some of the other texts. I do have a sense of what it means in practice, because it's all coming to a similar sort of a space. But those aren't the textual traditions I'm well versed in. So I didn't decide to do what my old journalist self would have done, which would be to wing it, to pretend and fly by the seat of my pants, fake it till I made it. But the last thing I really want to say is a lot of yoga traditions, particularly the ones that have, I guess, spread far and wide in India, are about devotion, and there's a lot of that in Tantra as well. And I grew up as an atheist, as a rationalist, and a little bit self-centered, analytically minded egomaniac. So I was never very drawn to devotion. And in fact, instead, I was drawn to analysis and to picking holes in things and asking questions all the time. And yeah, but, and constantly, grinding away with my mind. And I see that in some ways, the practice that probably would have been the fast track for me, the shortcut through all of that, would have been to somehow let go of all of that by diving deep into just surrender to something bigger than me. And I found that very difficult to do. It's just not my tendency. And sometimes I think that the practices that aren't our tendencies are the ones we should definitely go for. Instead, my slightly anally retentive type A driven nature drew me to the Iyengar and Ashtanga methods, both of which I overdid it with to the point that I hurt my body. So I think I got my lesson from that. But in the end, I think it's very hard as a Westerner, especially one raised in this. I mean, it's a bit different in the United States, I'm aware, but certainly in Europe, a very post-Christian age. So we've got a Christian sort of mythological background to the world we inhabit, but we just don't really engage with that religion. Many people go to Eastern religions to find the thing that they used to, or perhaps a few generations ago they might have drawn from their own traditions. There are Christian mystical traditions, there are Western pagan mystical traditions, and in some ways perhaps that's the future of Western yoga philosophy, is to actually make it Western again and to realize we've got our own ideas that we're addressing these same problems. Therefore, we can again be yoga inspired in that quest. So again, I've got a little bit, a few wrong turns again, but hopefully came back vaguely on track by the end. Was that the sort of answer you were after? Or?
Oh, it's the answer I received. So that's okay.
Okay, fair enough. So, any other questions?
Tons, but we want to be respectful of your time.
We can have one more then. Let's take.
Let's see, Genevieve, you haven't had a chance to ask any. Do you have a question?
Can find the unmute button.
Yeah, no, I hear you now. Yeah.
I think my quest for learning more and more about yoga is because when I teach, most of the time I feel like I'm an imposter, because this is not my tradition. This is not where I'm from. This is totally different philosophy. So how do I make that, how do I say, that balance within me, that I'm actually teaching something that I may not understand fully. And I don't know if any other person has that problem, but I often feel like I'm an imposter. And is it right for me to be teaching something that doesn't come from my culture?
A really good question. And again, I think, that's a sign of sincere honesty and actually radical truth telling. I don't know how many people will actually admit to it, but I think most go through the process of asking that question unless they're borderline psychopaths, because we can't possibly know everything about yoga, and we must on some level know deep down that there are teachers out there who know more than us, or who are better placed to present this thing that we're doing. So it's tempting to just sort of roll everything up, shut up shop, never do it again. And I think we should only do what we feel moved to do is the number one thing. If it doesn't feel right to teach, it's okay not to teach. Maybe I've since the pandemic hit and my local classes stopped, I've just stepped away really from teaching regular asana classes. I'll do it once in a while if asked, but it's no longer what I do. And I feel quite comfortable with that, because I was always feeling like you should go to my teacher, you shouldn't come to me. I mean, I felt very happy teaching absolute beginners and anybody who just wanted to ask a few questions. But in the end, if somebody's really a sincere student coming again and again and again, there are more knowledgeable asana teachers than me out there. So it's hard not to think that way. But I think the other thing to balance that with, and perhaps to sort of subdue that doubt with, is to remember that there's something about this tradition that spoke to us. That's why we do what we do. And as I was trying to say in relation to the book, if we can be actually standing in the place that we know about and talking about what we're actually genuinely deep down in our bones clear about or comfortable with, or able to express from our own life experience, that's powerful, and it will be helpful. And if all we ultimately do as yoga teachers, and whatever form it is to help people to come into a space where there is a slight shift in perspective towards something that is a little more wholesome, a little more beneficial, a little bit more comfortable, whether it's comfortably embodied, comfortable in the mind. I think that's a start of a process that could, who knows how far it could go. And even just sowing that seed is a positive contribution. So to stop oneself teaching yoga just because we can't do it all, when we can still do that very important thing, would be a shame, I think. And there's sometimes debates online that make it sound as if, that's what all non-Indian yoga teachers ought to think of doing. Should get out of the way and let the Indians take their turn. Well, maybe, but I don't know how helpful that is. I think in the end, there's space for everybody to share what they know, and so long as we feel comfortable doing that, then keep doing it. Is my thought, and also keep being honest about the discomfort. It's hard to admit to the fears we have. I think that's the first step towards transcending them. Certainly, my old approach of pretending nothing frightens me at all, and dealing with the dissonance between the reality of what I felt inside and what I tried to pretend to the outside world was very painful. And I used to manage that with various addictive behaviors. And I think in the end, I turned my yoga practice into a form of addictive behavior as well. So I'm now learning to face the tendency in my mind that does those things. And it's life. We muddle along as best we can, but being able to actually admit that we feel uncomfortable is a sign of progress, in my opinion, at least since I've started to realize I need to do more of it anyway. So,
awesome. Thank you. And I do, just to add to that, I think probably everybody on this screen has had those feelings, just knowing this group. We're also, there's the common themes of humanity, right? And,
exactly.
If we can bring some ease and help other people find what we have found in the practice, that's a step.
100%. Yeah, I just cannot in my heart see how that could possibly be a bad thing.
Yeah. Daniel, as always, amazing.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for some really good questions. And I hope I didn't ramble on too much. I know I tend to a little.
No, we so appreciate the time that you've given in our small little group, and this is such an important part of what we're trying to do in our 300 hours, these conversations. So the fact that we have somebody who I know I admire deeply, and I know Melissa does as well, and yet is able to offer to us these explorations in such a accessible way is just so deeply appreciated. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, back at you. I really appreciate the fact that you're doing this. If only more teacher trainings were actually interested in asking awkward questions and being, I guess, I was going to say broad-minded, but, open-hearted enough. I think it really is to be able to hold some of the discomfort and the tension that arises around it, rather than just talking about the idea of doing that while then carrying on doing the same old thing. It's really important to have these conversations and to just to keep inquiring. Yoga, if it's anything, is inquiry, and we've just got to keep exploring. And the more we can do that, verbally, non-verbally, physically, mentally, however it might be, it's going to be helpful, I think.
Great.
Okay, then. I wish you all well with the rest of the training, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Bye.
See ya.
Bye.